All right, folks, super happy to have you back. Welcome back to Talk Track, a Telegraph podcast where we talk about and respond to the events of the day and what's actually moving the railroad community forward. I'm joined today here in person for, I guess, not the first time.
First
Uh,
time in this context.
First time in this context, right? With David Carell, our head of freight market intelligence, and we're going to be talking about things that are really applicable to railroads, shippers, leasing companies, 3PLs, really anybody that's shipping by rail. And the topic for today is, unsurprisingly to anyone watching, the revised UP-NS merger filing. Dave, welcome to the conversation. What was kind of your initial response to the filing? To just kind of set the stage a little bit.
Honestly, I'd call it nonplussed, if you will. I mean,
What a word.
I just don't think that it changes the important things. And I guess to my mind, the important things are, is this thing going to get approved? And what is it going to look like when, and we'll get into it, I believe it will be approved. And so, we're all watching for the new application to come out. But to my mind, really what happened is they did the thing they were assigned to do by the deadline in
Right.
the way that they were assigned to do it. So the needle didn't change in my mind.
Okay. Now, Dave, for those who haven't been following your career as closely as the rest of us, you have at certain times dabbled as a professor, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
so it sounds like what you're saying is the submission was turned in by the April 30th due date. The assignment was apply and kind of validate why the Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern should come together as one singular entity, end-to-end offering. And you felt like the box was effectively checked, right?
That's exactly it. And shout out to anyone else with a career in education. I think that's exactly the right analogy. That the first application was strong, and lots of people talked about it, including us. It was missing certain pieces. The teachers in this analogy, if you will, said, if you want an A, this is what you've got to do. And responsible students did that. And maybe nonplussed is a little bit less celebratory of a term than I should have used, because they did add a lot. I mean, the data that came into this new application is impressive and new. The arguments in there are impressive and new, but when I really distill it down to what are the outcomes that I think you and I are watching and frequently talking about, it's approval in what form, and this submission didn't change my perspective on how that's going to play out.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because effectively the entire document, I think, moved from roughly 6,800 pages, roughly like a little north of 7,000, right? So the addition of I love that there was a reference to, we're using actual data.
Yeah.
That word was used a couple of times, which I chuckled at a little bit, because it gives the impression that actual data was not used in the first time, which I don't honestly think that is the case, but I'm not sure if that's actually the banner you want to be marching forward under. The other thing that I've noticed as we've kind of had some off-camera conversations is that you've kind of brought in a little bit of cynicism to the conversation, both from the reality of the application, the framing of the network, the merger rules, and then also I think some more environmental concerns, whether that's around like the actual impact of the shippers. Could you tell us a little bit more about why maybe you were nonplussed?
I'd be happy to, but also, I want to make sure, we hear your perspective from it too, because I think you come at it from, deep operational experience and personal experience with some of the parties involved. But I guess, for me, I see this as a very interesting and frankly deeply political moment in national industry. And so the things that pop out in my mind as I'm observing this are less about, if the application says that they may divest out of this part, or this is the definition of the watershed. I mean, technically that's interesting, but I personally think that what makes this thing happen is political in nature, and that's not in the 7,000 pages.
Right.
Nor should it be. Mm-hmm. So the 7,000 pages is, interesting to me as, someone like all of us here who love data. It's cool to see data at the forefront, especially actual data.
Yes.
of the decision making. But the cynicism, I guess, I'm bringing to the conversation, and this is maybe looking at it through that lens of current history and politics, is that's where I think this thing gets decided. I don't think it's within the technical documentation, but I'd love to hear your take because I think you're closer to the actual operational details described in that data, than a lot of people.
The grand irony in all of this that I haven't heard a ton of people talk about is that the reason why there are new merger rules is the big event that actually brought a lot of this to bear was the Union Pacific and Southern Pacific merger. So the UPSB tie-up eventually led to the ruling in 2001. And yeah, there was the BNSF acquisition of the Santa Fe, right? And then you obviously had the UPSP piece, and there's a lot of merger activity that went, and really where that came from was in the 80s after the Staggers Act and the overall deregulation of the industry. We kind of reduced from a lot of railroads, hundreds of different railroads, down to effectively where we are today, which was 7, now 6. Yeah. And so one of the really interesting things about that is that whenever one of those big mergers had happened, and I think the UPSB is probably most prominent, the Norfolk Southern CSX Conrail kind of thing is also very prominent, but there were months of just lost cars, freight bills and invoices that were not able to be filed. And so shippers were sending things oftentimes what it felt like into a black hole. They weren't sure when they were going to have to be paying for something. And on the UPSP piece specifically, I mean, the city of Houston, for a good portion of that, almost felt like it was shutting down, right? Oh. Grain was rotting in elevators, on trains. I mean, it just was, it was really messy. And the follow-up to the ICC, the STB, had to issue some emergency orders. I mean, they were really having to come in heavy-handed. And so I think even at that time, I think it was Dick Davidson, the UP leader at the time, had to go talk in front of Congress. And so right around 2001, the STB put out this new set of rules, or I think it's EP 528, which effectively said when evaluating a merger, it can't just be an evaluation of whether the benefits outweigh the harm. The harm was very explicit. It's that not only does it satisfy some of those expectations, but does it add competition back into the overall mix? And so that's one of the really, really, really interesting things, is that there has basically been this argument and counter argument that consolidation have somewhat favorably market concentrated towards the railroad market is going to lead to more competition. And I think that is a question that I candidly have been wrestling with. What I will say is, from an operational standpoint, this makes a ton of sense all day long. Yeah. The first question that I asked when I was a management trainee sitting in Fort Worth, Texas, sitting in this giant conference room was, why don't we just tie up with another East Coast railroad? Why don't we do the direct line service? Yeah. That would make the most sense to me, because there are fewer handoffs, there are fewer touch points, all the things that are being advertised as benefits today. That absolutely makes a ton of operational sense for me for delivering value to the end customer. But if you zoom out, I think you see, and if you take the time to evaluate history, definitely begin to understand that there are reasons why the network exists in the way that it does today.
And if I could pull on that thread, because one of the things that I've been thinking about is and I really enjoyed your recent piece on just understanding how new these rules are. And so it's not only a conversation about these two companies trying to merge, it's a conversation about, are these rules going to work? Like, can anyone meet that burden of proof? But so I get the idea about enhanced competition, and maybe we can talk about some of the ways that the merger application speaks to that. But I wonder, as you read it with that experience, does enhanced competition necessarily mean good things for shippers? Because it feels to me like those two ideas don't always have to connect. They may be separate from one another in a way that some shipper might say, well, I guess competition was enhanced, but nothing good happened for me.
Right. And so again, broadly, how is competition defined? I think it's that is, I think, a great question to begin with and define. Fortunately, you and I don't necessarily need to do that today, right? That is set aside for a higher body to rule on. Right. But I think when I think about competition within the rail industry, what it really comes down to is really a function of basically the price to value kind of equation, right? So is the price that I'm paying fair relative to the value that I'm getting? And so when you think about the two sides of that discussion, right, The railroads are always going to say, because the network is defined and constrained and has natural inherent benefits, whether that's for the environment or the available capacity or trucks coming off the highway, that is creating some sort of value of moving goods from point A to point B. And candidly, I'm biased in this way. I think the rail network is very valuable relative to a lot of other modes of transportation. I think the challenge for a shipper is, because they operate in a much more wider view of the world and have different modalities and options, they would argue that value is not always what the railroad assigns to it from a price standpoint, or maybe even what they believe from a hubris or an ego standpoint. So I think for a shipper, they would look at competition really across a couple of vectors, right? Number one is price. And so that price relative to other rail rates, or that price relative to rail rates that might compare to a trucking lane, or rail rates comparing to a barge lane, right? Which really draws into the watershed conversation.
Yeah.
I think the second thing is really around service. And so if I can have, in a fairly loose, becoming tight truck market, that gives me fairly reputable service and is pretty consistent, and I have other tangential benefits to that operational mode, trucking visibility, rate transparency, all those other things, I might argue that if rail rates go up but service remains the same or gets worse, that is not an increase in competition.
Yeah. And how that framing comes up at the STB will be so interesting. Just thinking that, like, if you define competition as only amongst class ones, hard argument to make. But I like the way you framed it, and I think that's, the argument that will likely win the day is it has to be multimodal competition. Now
Right.
you're saying that we can move from west to east on rail in a way that is competitive with truck, and that performance, that speed performance or service performance, will force everyone to elevate their game.
Right.
I think that's the notion.
Yeah. So look, when the STB chair at the time, I think it was Linda Morgan, set out to really establish these rules, it was a widespread acknowledgement that post staggers in a deregulatory environment was a net positive for the rail industry. A couple of things happened, right? There was a lot of consolidation, so probably some stronger and lesser participants in the market figured out a way that they could offer that to work. And we, in the industry, we tend to call that line rationalization or service rationalization. And so it was good for some of that to happen. The challenge with that is that there was a natural consolidation of market power. And so that collapse of 400 down to 7, and those 7 or 6, or depending on how you defined it, 4 within the actual continental United States, they control 80-90% of all the rail traffic. And so I think it's tough to argue that there isn't market power there.
Yeah.
And so it's also, I think, increasingly harder to argue that if you reduce that power down even further, that there is an increase in competition. And the way that I think about competition is you have price, you have service, and those two things are kind of out there for the different modes. But the challenge is, I think it really needs to be defined as, if you are a pure rail shipper, meaning you ship via the railroad for a good portion of your freight, you may not have the optionality of going to truck. And so really the competition for you becomes 2 or 3 or 4 competing railroads that are coming into usually a multi-serve facility, or hopefully you're not one of the single serve facilities, and you're looking for different options and lacking that. I think that's where the rule really comes in. It is not just does it maintain, but does it increase competition? And I think that's the important piece that I candidly, just have really struggled with, because operationally it makes sense all day long. But I think there's an argument that at some point, too much consolidation looks like a monopoly. And then if it's a monopoly, well, then I think the argument for nationalization becomes like a real icky thing.
And that's one of the things that I enjoy about the application package. I think they do a thorough job of saying, like, we've counted all the times that we see a shipper going from 3 to 2 or 2 to 1 service options. Like, those are things they're counting and at least reporting their picture on. Maybe, I guess I have another hang up about this that I'd like to stress test with you. UP and NS are publicly traded companies. If they achieve savings here, just by virtue of the system that we live in, they are beholden to their shareholders to pass those savings along to their shareholders first, not to the shippers. And so I guess I get a little uneasy when I hear the argument that, well, we're going to rationalize. There certainly are cost savings involved in the merger, but isn't it foolhardy to expect that a private or a public company would pass those savings along to anyone but the shareholders, to the value of the company?
Yeah. So when I think about savings that are kind of embedded into the overall application and offering, the thing that I keep coming back to is how are those savings going to be realized? And then once we kind of answer that, we can then answer about how that can or should flow.
Yeah.
When I think about the savings that will be generated from any combination, a couple of different things. So number one, the resources that you independently needed to operate those independent networks probably come together in some form. And there is definitely some overlap. There's definitely overlap here in Chicago of crews that go from one yard to another, and they are a part of separate yards and separate entities and maybe even similar unions. But the fact that you need to be staffed at individual locations at a higher level than you would for just a joint entity, like I'm sorry, like that is a blatantly obvious area where I think people are gonna investigate. I think the other thing is you can probably pull locomotives, crews, things like that, and so there should be some natural savings that you're allowed to extract out of that through a combination. The challenge that I've had with that is that we're operating in an environment where volume looks like this today. My expectation is that volume is going to look like this tomorrow. But if the resources that you needed to operate at this level are here, and then they're set and they've been satisfied here for a couple of years, you're going to need to have more resources to actually improve the service or offer capacity for more volume. So I think that's one area where you can probably provide some sort of savings. It's just like resource pooling and better allocation. The second question really comes into where are those savings going to naturally flow? Well, I think in the to quote Tony Hatch, we're still in the cult of the OR era where we're still obsessed with that metric. And look, like it's a fairly simple metric for those of us who don't claim math as like our predominant major. It really comes down to the fact that, you're either going to drive more revenue or you're going to extract costs out of the operating environment. The combination clearly extracts costs out of the operating environment. It isn't clear to me how there's going to be a massive increase in revenue. And I think CEO of Norfolk Southern has articulated that point very well, saying in front of a very wide audience, every 5 years we say numbers are going to go up and to the right and volume continues to go down or remain flat. And so the question really becomes, are you going to continue to tell the story of the 30th consecutive quarter of revenue per unit growth, which means that you're getting pricing power, but you're not getting volume? I think those two things are not really aligned with one another.
I think you're right, and it's a whole other conversation, I guess, around some of our independent analysis we've done on like if intermodal is the growth engine, how much runway is there really left to grow? I'm a little bearish on that myself, honestly, but that's analysis we're doing, and we can have a whole
well, you spend a lot of time with Larry Gross, so that's understandable. Larry, no, that was a good joke, well timed, but I think Larry shares some of that sentiment as well.
I understand the notion that, well, if you're going to look for growth, you don't have that many places to look, and that's your best place to look. Personally, I just, as I analyze some of our data and other national data sets, I don't see the potential for a hockey stick. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is that like this is a tool to chase growth, maybe chasing growth that's not catchable.
So this is where you and I definitely diverge pretty clearly here. I continue to believe that there is a hockey stick potential out there, but it's mainly from the fact of, and I keep going back to this, right? If we went back and looked at, and I was fortunate to work at two different institutions that talked about revenue per unit growth, and they talked about it for so long that it became almost a thing that if there was a prediction market, you probably could have won millions of dollars by just betting that they were going to talk about RPU going up quarter over quarter. And that's just kind of how it is. So what is the downside to RPU going up quarter over quarter? If in a world volume is relatively flat, it means that you continue to take price. And I am in no way, shape, or form saying that the railroad network is not increasingly valuable in an inflationary, highly capital intensive market. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that if others out there believe that volume may not be as strong in the future, what are some factors behind that? Do we think that consumer demand is depressed? Do we think that more people are not going to build homes? Do we think that more people are not going to consume food? No, I believe all of those things to be true. And so if I believe that those things to be true, going back to your point around what are the savings that potentially could be passed on, I got to be honest with you. I'm not sure that any investor is like really excited about the 45th quarter of revenue per unit growth if the underlying volume down below isn't supporting that. And so I think the way that you return the savings back to the shippers who ultimately pay the line haul bills would be to think about becoming very aggressive on price. And if you become very aggressive on price, maybe you attract some of that volume back. And so maybe and in that situation, I prove the dissenters like David wrong. Yeah. And showing that we can grow both revenue and volume, but in aggregate, right? We bring all those two things together. That's where I think the underlying interesting piece of this is. And so that's why I've struggled, as I talked about in the opening. If this merger comes together, yes, that market power has this like massive shroud of being negative. But what if they put that pricing power to work? What if they made it much more attractive? What if that was the line? That's what I'm candidly excited about the potential of. The challenge is nothing in the merger documents or nothing that's been said publicly at any shipper conference would lead me to believe that's going to happen. But that is one of the things that would prove all of us wrong, which would be great.
I like that mechanism, and I think that logic internally stands that we've squeezed cost out so we can be more aggressive on pricing. That means that we should be able to draw in more volume.
Yes.
But I think you're only compelled to do that in competitive lanes. Like what I think the coalition against the rail merger is most afraid of is where they go from 2 to 1. I don't know that there's a reason in markets that go 2 to 1, so now they're sole served, to lower the price.
That is so putting aside that point for a second, the anti-merger consortium. Like I this is an industry that loves consortiums. They love groups. They love I guess not making an independent decision without one another. And you know that I joke about that, but I think behind the scenes it is the only true network effect business that exists physically in the ground. And so there is some sort of we kind of have to have some sort of alignment to make this all work. I was candidly surprised to see the consortium come out the day before the merger filing came in. But to your point, I think like we have so many elements of history that when you do reduce competition, you really eliminate the need to potentially lower prices. There's an optimist in me that believes over the long term, over the hill, over the horizon, that if you want the industry to grow, you have to make long-term decisions that may not be necessarily positive for the hedge fund that is banging the drum and pushing your executive team to do certain things.
That's a great point. I think that's part of the tension that will decide, if the savings are, flow or accrue to the shipper community or accrue to the owners of the company.
Yeah, sure.
In that sense.
Sure. And in no way, shape, or form am I arguing for that the owners of the company do not have a right to extract the value from the money that they've invested. Yeah. No way, shape, or form am I arguing for that. What I'm arguing for is probably a longer time frame with which to extract that value that looks less like a 90-day constant review and rigmarole, and probably more like what does the 5-year time horizon look like?
One more concern that's kind of in my mind as I think about this is, and we've talked about how there's the technical details that matter, and I think that discussion was really helpful. But I think this is a major political football too. And, when I think about merger approvals in the last 2 to 3 years, it's been something that the White House has been very involved in. I think that we've seen that this particular administration really takes a look at mergers and sometimes involves itself, as it has in this one. We've seen some pretty high-level people in the administration support this publicly. And so I guess, when I look at that history, I don't think the current history lines up in a way that I would ever expect this board to make a decision contrary to what this White House wants. Do you feel the weight of that on the STB when you think about what they might do, or do you see it differently?
No, I've always been impressed with the folks who choose to go down the path of sitting on the STB. It feels very much to me like a very independent, very neutral organization. However, I think we've seen a lot of intermingling, that would lead me to believe that is a valid question to ask. But I absolutely think that STB is going to weigh all the things, and I think they will weigh the prior rules appropriately. I think they were set into place. I think the call out that I had is that this is effectively it's an exam that's never never been given before, right? These rules have never actually been tested, and so I think that they will do the right thing to test all of that. I think what is really interesting is we've kind of gone through a period where the FTC, one of the government organizations was very much against mergers, and so we've now seen a period of that opening up a little bit. But I think there has been some rationalization, right? There was some murmuring recently that United was taking a look at American, which I gotta hand it to Scott Kirby. No one has been more aggrieved and willing to troll his former employer than Scott. I mean, every chance he gets, he takes it to American. And part of me felt like this was just an opportunity for him to talk about how poorly they've been doing and how well United has been performing. But obviously that got shot down pretty quickly, because I think some of the things that we've been talking about from a market power standpoint would be grossly evident in that scenario. And so if I take that line of rationalization and think about that, I think similar things are going to play out here. My belief is that the STB is going to take a look at this, take a look at the rules, and I'm not exactly sure that the argument has been made that competition will be increased as a result of this. I think that it can be. I think that argument could have been made. In fact, if I was sitting there are ways that I would make that argument, but I don't think the merger as it stands and the way that it's been presented today has done enough to meet the bar. Yes, operationally it makes sense for me. I'm a thumbs up for a variety of reasons, but from a commercial standpoint, I don't think the argument has been fully made, even with the new actual data that's been included.
And so then looking ahead, what are you looking for? What would you tell a listener, like, here's on my horizon, things that might come up short-term, medium-term?
Yeah, I think number one, this is going to be an interesting review period, right? So I think we'll get our first blush before June 30th of what the STB has taken in as far as additional information and we'll be looking for. I think the first real thing I am going to be kind of like, whatever comes out of it is really that Schedule 5.8, which in the merger was, if there is really, a lot of it has to do with concessions. There's an out. And that out was not clearly made public between UP and NS in the prior filings. But the way that I read that is that if there are any line sales or trackage rights considerations that are introduced into the process as a form of concessions, which was not in the original filing,
right?
And depending on how this plays out in this filing, what I really begin to question is, that is actually the element that would create more competition. And so if UP now has the right to walk away, if those are introduced and chooses to do so, that would tell me this really wasn't about increased competition, which is a little bit alarming for me. But I think that'll be the thing that I'm watching for, because the only way to make this work is to figure out a way to introduce some concessions in some areas on some lines.
And let me interject the kind of concession I'm looking for, because I don't think it's being talked about enough, but in my view of the world, it's a real possibility. A government stake in the merged Transcontinental Railroad. We've seen that in so many mergers that have been approved in recent years. Recent reporting today talks about how even in the airline mergers we were talking about, there was conversations with the White House about taking a stake. I think, if UP comes out and says, as you described, these are the concessions that are no-goes for us, that's not one of the things they mentioned as a no-go. That's
True. Yeah.
For a concession that I think could really change the way railroads operate, to have a sort of partially government-owned front-runner national champion Transcontinental Railroad is possible.
I don't disagree with you. It was an element that I really hadn't thought about, but it's interesting when you think about heavily regulated industries versus lightly regulated industries, and you think about the history of the railroad as somewhat being enabled by the government, but always wanting to keep it at arm's distance. That is an interesting way that it feels like you're pulling that in and saying that is it's almost an invitation for more scrutiny, which is a really interesting dynamic that I haven't really thought about before.
And I don't think any of us would know how to operate in that environment and be entirely new, but I think it's also entirely plausible.
Yeah. Okay. Well, folks, really appreciate you joining for yet another episode of Talk Track. David, it was great to have you in person this week. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for a really good conversation today. And folks, as you can tell, we don't always agree on everything, but thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode. Oh, and by the way, feel free to follow us on LinkedIn or visit us at www.telegraph.io. Thanks for watching.